For the last 50 years, a virus-like social order, steeped in heresy and violence, has coagulated and permeated the pores of modern culture. Operating from the darkness, the Order of Nine Angles have infiltrated the modern political, social, and cultural landscape with one main goal in mind: the destruction of Western civilization. Welcome to the WEIRDNET. The Order of Nine Angles can't really be described as an order as such, or even a group really. In fact, it wouldn't be incorrect to say that they don't exist at all. They have no membership, leadership, lodges or temples. There is no hierarchy, and no fees or financial contributions are required. Instead, they're a self-described, subversive, sinister, esoteric association made up of diverse subgroups bound by a code of kindred honour and dedicated to following what's known as the Sevenfold way, a tradition with roots in ancient Greek and Arabic mysticism, complete with its own idiosyncratic but coherent model of the universe. A lot has been written in the mainstream press in recent years regarding the Order of Nine Angles, much of which is either completely incorrect or grossly oversimplified. Their portrayal by certain groups as a bunch of devil-worshipping Nazis turns them into comedic figures, but the reality of their ideology and the practices they engage in are far, far more dangerous and demonstrate a very real threat to the fabric of society in these tumultuous times. In this video, I'd like to try to cut through the bullshit and present the facts about the ONA without the hyperbole and without sensationalising anything. I've been involved in the study and practice of the occult for over 20 years, so I'd like to think I can provide some context and explain, to some extent at least, why the ONA engage in such extreme practices. The Order of Nine Angles have their roots in the west of England, specifically Shropshire in the late 1960s. The story goes that an unnamed woman, known simply as the Grand Mistress, active in the satanic groups around the Welsh Marches, decided to unite 3 traditional satanic temples under the banner of the ONA. Now, the idea of traditional Satanism is something we'll look into more shortly, but for the moment it's sufficient to know that it's not the same as the modern Church of Satan or related groups, for example, the Temple of Set. The groups which became the ONA claimed that their heritage lay in pre-Christianity, preserved through a secret oral tradition and passed one-on-one from teacher to student for centuries. They claim to have had their basis in the goddess cults of ancient times, worshipping Baphomet as a symbol of chaos and the archetypal feminine, in diametric opposition to what they view as the patriarchal systems of, as they refer to it, the Magian current found in Christianity. Between 1968 and 1972, the Order of Nine Angles went about their secretive business, presumably doing devilish things and such like, until a mysterious figure known as Anton Long appeared. As someone who claimed to have travelled the world, studied many different mystical traditions, and been involved with other traditional satanic groups, this young man would become the first, since the creation of the ONA, to be permitted to join. When the Grand Mistress emigrated to Australia, she appointed Long as her heir. Upon assuming the position of Grand Master, Long began to publish thousands of pages, largely written by him, detailing the theory and practice of the order. These works would be circulated among groups aligned with other left-hand path practices, advertised in the homemade zines of the 70s and 80s, and passed surreptitiously between armchair occultists throughout England. Over time, their reach would expand throughout the Western world, sparking deeper interest in the ONA and bringing more people to their teachings. From 1973 until 1985, the Order of Nine Angles began their process of evolution as they implemented the first phase of their Sinister strategy. The appearance of increasingly extreme materials, the inclusion of elements of National Socialism, social Darwinism, and their infamous support for culling, all tied in with traditional Satanism, exoteric and esoteric magical practices, would set the ONA apart from pretty much every other satanic group in existence at the time. Over those years, Anton Long set about restructuring the teachings he claimed to have received from the Grand Mistress, synthesizing seemingly incompatible traditions from the pre-Aristotelian to the complex tracts of Middle Eastern alchemy. It appears that Long deliberately created an entirely new lexicon to describe the reality tunnel of the Order of Nine Angles in such a way that it would not, or at least should not, be confused with pre-existing symbolism in other traditions. In 1985, they entered what they call their second iteration. In this stage of their Sinister strategy, Long made available works which the ONA claimed had been held in secret, guarded from those without sufficient advancement and entirely hidden from the uninitiated. The Black Book of Satan, which concerns itself primarily with ceremonial magic, and Naos, a practical guide to sinister hermetic magic, which aims more at what we could call internal magic, or a very specific form of self-development and evolution. These titles form the basis for much of the ONA's practical system, while the additional works available tended to be more philosophical, explaining the ins and outs of their rituals and providing commentary on the esoteric meanings therein. Another very important development during this time was the introduction of the Star Game, which is a chess-like board game made by hand by each initiate and used as something akin to a living magical sigil, as well as being a method of training in and of itself, and a game which could be played alone or with an opponent. This intricate and unique game claims to allow the player to understand certain fundamental processes involved in our causal, linear experience, while also introducing one to what the ONA termed the acausal, a non-Euclidean end space wherein lie all manner of dark gods and forces which can be present in our causal world through ritual means. It was during this second iteration that Long really introduced and implemented the Sevenfold way as the roadmap for progress, and began actively encouraging members to start their own satanic temples. These temples were not ONA temples. They were unique to each individual who, often as part of their initiatory journey along the way, set them up as an exercise in self-understanding and a way to practice satanic rituals regularly, independent of the ONA itself but still informed by it. According to their own timeline, the second iteration carried on until 2009, which was around the first time I came across them, and by 2011, around 10,000 pages of writings had been made available online. The importance of the advent of the internet and the development of the ONA cannot be understated, but at the same time, it's worth recognising that they seem to have managed to survive 20 plus years of snail mail and DIY publication before gaining access to the online world. Original copies of the texts, often handwritten by Long and his associates, are available to view, some of which date back to the late 1970s, so I think it's fair to say that the Order of Nine Angles have been around since at least 1976. All in all, the reported history and evolution leaves more questions than answers, but that's not entirely surprising to anyone familiar with these sorts of so-called secret societies. Well-known groups such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn or The Rosicrucians have equally fanciful backstories, but the ONA are a very different animal. Whether or not there is any truth in their claims with regards to their mystical lineage, I have no idea. What I will say is that, as with every other occult group, the use of myth, allegory and metaphor is a certainty, and so taking their words literally would, in my opinion, be a mistake. With that said, anyone who takes the time to actually read what the ONA freely publishes will see that they have no issue in being quite explicit about what they do and what they believe. But given the complex, pseudo-intellectual nature of a lot of the writings, and the tendency in occult circles to use linguistic blends to obscure meaning, it can be hard to tell for sure. The fact that they have actually managed to remain active and have maintained a presence in a world which is notoriously elitist and destructive indicates to me that the ONA aren't, as some would suggest, a bunch of edgelord teenage boys. As we've already seen, and as we'll see more as we go, the ONA is a complicated, potentially dangerous system of theory and practice which takes each initiate to their own extremes to either make them or break them. I've used the term traditional Satanism because that's the term that the ONA use to describe their own belief system, and it's just easier to avoid that confusion. They do so to purposely set themselves apart from other self-proclaimed satanic groups, and by extension to lay claim to having some sort of true and superior knowledge of Satanism rather than the less than sinister, more philosophical Satanism of LaVey and co. The idea of an argument over who is more satanic seems ridiculous, but one look at the differences between the practices of the ONA and any other non-traditional satanic group seems to make it clear that if we're using the biblical idea of Satan as the personification of evil, the ONA are way closer to a genuinely heretical, chaotic and amoral expression of what Satan as a word refers to. Now, I'm not going to get into the differences between, say, the Temple of Set and the ONA in terms of their practice of Satanism, because it would be about as much use as Prince's drum kit. It's sufficient to say that they're not the same thing, and although they inevitably share similarities, most of them involve nuance and considerable understanding of the worldview involved. Traditional Satanism, as it is understood in the ONA, has its roots in the pre-Christian goddess cults and a long-standing oral tradition which apparently existed for 5,000 years but was never written down until the 1970s. One of the foundations of this particular current lies in the worship of Baphomet, the mistress of blood, who is regarded as both the bride and mother of Satan. Worship of the feminine was far more common in pre-Christian times, and countless pagan groups to this day continue that tradition, but the ONA places considerable importance on the role of women and an appreciation thereof. She represents primordial chaos, that which existed before order arose, Tiamat and other related archetypes, each embodying the chaotic yet potential-filled forces of nature. While groups like the Temple of Set view Satan as more of a representation of the Promethean aspects of humanity, the Order of Nine Angles posit that there exists an actual being who can and has been active in the physical world and whom, along with a host of other dark gods, the ONA would like to have around again. A big difference in the ONA's idea of Satan is that, unlike the Abrahamic religions, he's not dependent on the existence of a monotheistic god. Due to this, Satan is considered superior to what the ONA describe as an abstraction called God, used to confuse and enslave humanity by lying that some big bearded guy in the sky is watching you masturbate. Alright, so it's more serious than that, but you know what I mean. Ultimately, Any satanic group is based around being adversarial and presenting opposition to the status quo. By their very existence, they represent the darkness within and without, but few seem to take this quite as literally as the ONA. The Order of Nine Angles appear to practice what they preach and live their lives according to their sinister strategy. As I've said, the use of the whole traditional Satanism thing is largely a tool to make what the ONA believe seem unique to them, while also implying that their version of Satanism is the only true manifestation of that particular force. In reality though, every worldview is empty in the sense that it has no inherent meaning beyond that which we impute. With the ONA though, the imputation of meaning is part of the process of adopting their model of the universe and programming oneself to experience the world in a different way. Which brings us to the topic of how one would go about aligning oneself with the Order of Nine Angles. I said at the beginning that it wouldn't be incorrect to say that the ONA doesn't exist. To complicate things further, it also wouldn't be incorrect to say that nobody actually joins something called the Order of Nine Angles either. There are what appear to be paradoxes all over the place with the ONA, but they tend to resolve themselves when you begin to understand what the ONA is and what it is that they actually believe. Much as I'm trying to explain as much as possible, it's frustrating to have to condense and simplify things for the sake of brevity and not boring the proverbial tits off you, obviously. Anyone familiar with occult groups will know that initiation is integral to any order. It's the crossing of the threshold into a new way of experiencing the world, a way which is gradually imprinted as you absorb the teachings of whichever groups you're involved with. With most groups, initiation involves a complex group ritual, structured and performed in a very specific way and with the intent to bring about a change in the consciousness of the individual. Each stage and the tasks involved are designed to force a form of evolution so that they may become a different type of human being. The shocking and often disturbing aspects of each grade are intended to push the candidate to their absolute physical, psychological and spiritual limits so that they can see exactly what they're capable of. In Jungian terms, the ONA is largely focused on the recognition and integration of the shadow. Their dark, primal and often brutal drives that still run deep within our psyches, thinly veiled by civilized society. None of this is unique to the ONA, and the entire process of spiritual initiation and development works in basically the same way, but as you may expect, the ONA do things a little differently. There are 7 stages or grades within the ONA, each of which has its own series of rites and ordeals which must be completed before the next grade can be attained. It is entirely based on the individual themselves to judge whether or not they have completed each task as demanded of them, so there is a huge amount of importance on self-honesty and admitting when failure has occurred. It would be utterly pointless for someone to claim grades within the ONA without having the actual experience to back it up, since it would be fairly easy to tell whether or not they were actually telling the truth. Each ordeal demands extensive preparation, not to mention the willingness to engage in illegal activities, perhaps even going so far as to murder another human being. Of the 7 stages, only 6 are attainable by mortal beings, with the 7th being available only to those who have found what the ONA term lapis philosophicus, which is essentially something akin to the Philosopher's Stone or Jewel of the Alchemists. The grades are as follows, but we'll take a look at each one in a bit more detail. Neophyte, Initiate, External Adept, internal adept, master of the temple or mistress of earth, also known as Lady Master, Grand Master or Grand Mistress, and immortal. For the neophyte, their only real task is to undertake a ritual of self-initiation. This is effectively plugging in to the ONA reality tunnel, allowing yourself to adopt their worldview so that you can begin to see things in a more sinister manner. Anyone who feels inclined to do so can initiate themselves into the Order of Nine Angles. It's entirely down to the individual to make that choice, but those who wish to progress to become an actual initiate have far more demanded of them. For the initiate, there is first a series of physical tasks to be undertaken. For men, walking 32 miles over hilly terrain, carrying a backpack weighing no less than 30 pounds in under 7 hours. Additionally, you must run 26 miles in 4 hours and cycle 200 plus miles in 12 hours. Women are permitted to carry slightly less weight with them and must walk 27 miles in under 7 hours, run 26 miles in 4.5 hours, and cycle at least 170 miles in 12 hours. These are actual figures, and there are people who have completed these tasks, provided evidence to confirm it, and coached others in achieving the same, so please don't think that these are just some wild, fictitious demands to put people off. As well as the physical ordeals, the initiate must also engage in one of the most fascinating yet utterly terrifying aspects of the ONA: insight rolls. We'll go more into this shortly, but basically, the initiate must adopt a lifestyle and ideology that stands in diametric opposition to their normal life. For example, one of the most infamous insight roles is to infiltrate a far-right political group and actively encourage violence, breed hatred and cause mayhem. Lesser known though is the fact that an insight role can also include becoming a police officer, joining the army, becoming an environmentalist, or becoming a Buddhist monk. Which is why I said earlier how the idea of the ONA as black magic Nazis is almost comedic. The insight role is to be maintained for at least 12 to 18 months, and then, once success has been achieved, the initiate can begin preparation for the grade of external adept. For an external adept, they must form their own independent satanic temple, undertake another insight role, and begin preparation for the next grade. At one time, it was mandatory for the external adept to perform a culling, or in other words, murder someone or arrange events so that the target has a fatal accident. This is a complex subject and one that we'll also look into as a separate thing, but it's worth noting that this particular task is no longer quite as widely discussed or even encouraged. In fact, it's, perhaps unsurprisingly, something of a contentious issue within the ONA, but we'll get to that eventually. Another task of the external adept is to find an isolated hill, far away from human habitation, and, on the night of the new moon at sunset, lie still and without falling asleep until sunrise the next day. If you move or fall asleep, you fail. Simple as that. The next grade, that of the internal adept, can last anywhere between 5 and 11 years and is centred around fulfilling one's own unique destiny, which the tasks in the previous grades are supposed to have revealed to the candidate. This may sound all airy-fairy in light of the previous tasks, but as you've probably gathered, nothing is ever truly as it seems with the Order of Nine Angles. To really get into the detail on a lot of this stuff would lead to a massively long video, so I'm trying to stick to highlighting certain aspects and, unfortunately, oversimplifying things that I would much rather explore more deeply. To fully become an internal adept, the candidate is expected to live in the wild for between 3 and 6 months. They are permitted the choice as to whether they will bring their own supplies and tent, or whether they will build their own shelter and live off the land. They are not permitted any electronic devices, watches or clocks, and no means of recording or listening to any sort of music. The rite of the internal adept is intended to remove attachment from the everyday world of people and things, leaving the adept isolated with nothing but their own sensate experience to occupy them. If an ONA candidate wishes to progress further, which is apparently and likely unsurprisingly rare, then they must undertake what is known as the Rite of the Abyss. While the rite itself is basically living in a cave for 1 lunar month, the symbolism and requirements are too esoteric to really go into. Again, the candidate is in complete isolation, only being brought from their cave by a trusted family member or mentor who informs them when the rite is over. Becoming a Grand Mistress or Grand Master also includes another extended period in isolation, but involves attaining mastery in some esoteric, artisan or creative task, which in itself marks success in the rite. As with the earlier grades, the candidate in this case must also engage in extreme tests of physical endurance, walking 300 miles over difficult, isolated terrain in 15 days while carrying their equipment with them, only this time, the endpoint is supposed to be somewhere with which the candidate has an empathy. So as you can see, identifying with and living by the ethos of the Order of Nine Angles involves some serious commitment and the ability to push oneself to extremes. As I've said, the basic process of development involved here is not entirely unique, but the way in which it is executed and the man behind the teachings themselves tell us a lot about some of the more extreme aspects of the ONA. From this point on, things are going to get considerably darker. So far in this video, I've tried to stick to providing a very basic overview of the ONA and avoided going too much into the more disturbing side of things. To some, it may even seem as though I'm trying to present the Order of Nine Angles in a positive light, but I'm simply trying to stick to the facts and let you draw your own conclusions. However, we're about to take a look at the man who put all of this together and created one of the most dangerous yet intriguing occult groups to have existed so far. The identity of Anton Long has never been 100% confirmed, but all available evidence points to him being a man called David Myatt. Although some still dispute this, not least of all Myatt himself, who famously challenged two journalists to a duel over it. But for the sake of simplicity and going with the evidence, it's likely that Myatt and Long are one and the same person, and it also makes it a lot easier to write this. Now, David Myatt was originally born in Tanzania, only moving to the UK in 1967. After emigrating to Britain, he developed an interest in National Socialism and became active in neo-Nazi groups. He founded the National Socialist movement and set about spewing bile about the Aryan elite, anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and general support of that Austrian cunt with the stupid fucking moustache. His writings would become infamous, even influential, and eventually encouraging people like, most famously, David Copeland, the London nail bomber, who attempted to start a race war based on Myatt's words. He would call for the creation of racial terror, hold Hitler up as a hero who did nothing wrong and generally behaved like a cunt, but a cunt who actually had the power and charisma to make people take action. After 30 years of being a neo-Nazi, Myatt inexplicably converted to the notoriously peaceful religion of Islam, whereupon he began calls for jihad against the decadent Western world, advocated suicide attacks, publicly supported Osama bin Laden, and again, generally behaved like a bit of a cunt. While it may seem strange for someone as ardently anti-brown people as Maya to convert to Islam, it actually made perfect sense because, as he saw it, their aims generally aligned with those of the far right, i.e. the eradication of the Jewish people, destruction of liberal society, and the installation of a dictatorship. Islamofascism isn't exactly all that different from the fascism of the Nazis, so the transition wasn't quite as surprising as it might first appear. By 2010, he'd gotten bored of Islam and decided to launch his own mystical system known as the Numinous Way, which, given that he claimed to have nothing to do with the Order of Nine Angles, was oddly similar to a more toned-down version of what the ONA had been saying too, and also used a lot of the same idiosyncratic terminology. If we look at the history and evolution of the ONA, it also seems to have many similarities with the general evolution of Maya's worldviews over the decades. Early phases of the ONA definitely had more emphasis on far-right extremist ideas, illegal activities, political subversion and acts of violence. Later phases included the suggestion that the candidates undertake insight roles in Islamic fundamentalist groups, while more recent writings from the ONA indicate that their entire system has become more akin to a legitimate mystical order seeking something other than total chaos. For all of his faults, to consider Maya as some sort of brain-dead moron would be unfair and would underestimate how dangerous this one individual has been and potentially could be again. He appears to be a highly intelligent, if completely eccentric person who demonstrates fluency in several languages, deep knowledge of many religious and mystical traditions, and direct knowledge of terrorism and its application. Reading his work, it's clear that the guy knows what he's talking about and has actually done the things he claims to have done, believed what he claims to have believed, and lived the life he claims to have lived. While I don't want to confuse the ONA for the man known as Anton Long, it's hard to separate the two since he figures so highly in their history. There are and continue to be others who have written on behalf of the ONA, but Long remained the figurehead until 2011 when he declared that he had retired. Again, the appearance of David Maya's Numinous Way coincides with the retirement of Long. It seems silly to argue that Long and Maya are not the same person, but from a certain point of view it may not be incorrect to say that this is the case. The person who wrote as Anton Long in 1976 wouldn't have been the same person as the Anton Long who wrote in 2011. In fact, had he adhered to his own path, the application of which is intended to create a new person entirely, then he would be a changed man, and that does indeed appear to be the case. In more recent writings, Maya expresses what seems to be genuine regret over his use of far-right and fascistic materials. However, the Order of Nine Angles itself does still contain elements of his influence from those periods in his life. Having spent the last few months researching the ONA, it's been clear that, since I first encountered them about 10 years ago, they've changed and somewhat softened in some ways. Softened is probably the wrong word to use, but the emphasis on racial supremacy, ritual murder and blatant fascism seems toned down, with more importance being placed on the worship of the feminine, empathy and the contemplative life. Don't get me wrong, when I say that those elements are still present, I mean at a fundamental level, perhaps expressed best by what you'll see written as the Year of Fian, followed by a number. Fian is an extremely old Saxon word, signifying joy or rejoicing. Sounds fairly innocent, doesn't it? Until you find out that the Year of Fian is actually 1889, the year that Hitler was born. So for the ONA, 1889 represents year zero because they believe that the birth of Hitler and his actions were necessary for their own, what we could refer to as an antichrist figure known as Vindex, to arise and initiate the new eon. But I digress as usual. Maya's involvement in the aforementioned groups becomes more intriguing when we consider what the ONA call insight roles, which we briefly discussed earlier. It has been suggested that Maya was engaged in and may still be involved with insight roles when active with neo-Nazi groups and Islamofascists. This would actually make sense when we think about the seemingly radical shifts in belief systems he went through, and how seriously he maintained his commitment, typically publicly and without censorship, to each cause he identified with. Let's take a closer look at the theory and practice of insight roles, and how the Order of Nine Angles utilise them to train their candidates. Insight roles at their root are designed to take the candidate out of their comfort zone in an extreme manner, force them to behave in a way they may never have before, and most importantly, to break down their pre-existing ideas about the world. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most infamous insight roles, and one that seems to gain the ONA the most notoriety, is joining a far-right political party and fully engaging with their beliefs. One is expected to basically become as hardcore as possible about the beliefs involved, to fully immerse themselves in that reality and convince others that you're absolutely genuine about it all. Eventually, subversion is expected and the candidate begins to spread the memeplex of the ONA within the group and starts infecting it. It's this sort of activity that has led to neo-Nazi groups such as Atomwaffen declaring their hatred for the ONA and banning anyone from being involved with them if they are ONA. I mean, seriously, how fucked up do you need to be for even the Nazis to think you're a bad influence? Obviously, the most shocking and extreme insight roles are the ones that you're most likely to hear about, but the texts of the ONA from the very beginning have also recommended seemingly benign roles such as joining a Christian or Buddhist monastery and becoming a monk for 18 months, or joining up with the police so that you can have the opportunity to beat up black people without getting in trouble. Alright, so that last bit was a joke, but it's true that ONA members will join up with law enforcement, the armed forces, anarchists and even radical feminist groups, bizarre as that may seem at first, so long as it affords them the opportunity to experience a different reality tunnel to the one they experienced before and sow seeds of subversion. Taking on different identities and living in unfamiliar communities is a practice found in other traditions and often for similar ends to those pursued by the ONA. To consciously and dramatically shift your everyday experience to something completely alien to you will create changes in your perception, perhaps even leading to complete psychosis if you lack the mental fortitude to withstand the impact of change. It's these extremes and the risk of taking it too far that are the most important aspects of an insight role. It's sink or swim, and if you cannot cope with the challenges of the role you have assumed, then you will fail and potentially lose your mind or maybe even your life. To the ONA, your failure as an individual, even if that means your death, is simply proof that you were never the right sort of person to begin with. Fundamentally, an insight role should expose the strengths and weaknesses of each candidate and demonstrate to them whether or not they have what it takes to progress further in the ONA. It may also reveal to them what it is that they truly desire from life. For example, one may adopt an insight role as a Buddhist monk, but ultimately discover that the monastic life is actually where they belong. It is this process of personal revelation that's the most important when engaged in an insight role, but absolutely ruthless self-honesty is essential, otherwise you would just fall deeper and deeper into delusion. Most people couldn't handle a few days of adopting an entirely different worldview, never mind 18 months. It's not an easy thing to do, and it becomes increasingly difficult in a very short space of time, but it is ultimately achievable if you have the will to do it. As you can see, there is far more to the Order of Nine Angles than some would have you believe. But even then, I'm barely scratching the surface here. Now we come to one of the most controversial and misunderstood aspects of the Order of Nine Angles: culling, otherwise known as murder or possibly manslaughter if it's been a wink wink nudge nudge accident. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Culling is literally about killing people. But as always with the ONA, it's far more complicated than it seems at face value. To start with, it's important to point out that the ONA don't seem to just go about randomly killing people. Admittedly, people inspired by the ONA might do that sort of thing, but there's a very particular set of conditions involved in the selection and execution of what the ONA term as the Opfer, a German word which translates as victim. Don't get me wrong, the ONA literally loathe and despise probably 99% of other human beings, calling them mundanes and viewing them as no more than cattle. But they don't consider them to be worth the effort involved in killing and disposing of the bodies. An Opfer is supposed to be someone who has been determined to be of rotten character and whose words and deeds have shown them to be human waste. A typical example is something like a rapist who gets away with a crime because of the incompetence of the legal system, or someone who abuses children and is never jailed for it. Scum like this are considered fair game and are to be, for want of a better word, groomed to invite their own demise at the hands of either an ONA-inspired group or by a lone ONA associate. It's an oversimplification to just say that culling is about murder when, in reality, it's far, far more complicated and possibly even nothing more than an occult blind designed to shock outsiders or put off those considered unworthy. It's possible too that the whole idea of culling is another part of the insight roll process where, perhaps, the candidate literally does find themselves in a situation where they have to take the life of another and realises that they cannot do it, thus accepting that they're just not capable of such things. At the same time, it's entirely possible that someone may find that they can take a life with ease and without any remorse, never having previously realised that they were capable of it. Within the ONA itself, there is no strong agreement on whether or not the concept of culling is to be taken literally or simply treated as a leftover from a bygone era. It may seem that it makes sense for a group of real Satanists to be all for murdering people and doing evil stuff, but this lack of consensus on something so seemingly fundamental to the order is another indicator that it's not exactly what it seems on the surface. It also opens them up to being investigated by law enforcement for encouraging and inciting violence, so the continued downplaying of the role of culling in the ONA as a form of damage limitation makes sense too. If we look more into the history of culling and the reason for its inclusion within the ONA, it's largely related to old ideas of personal honour and justice, similar in many ways to the honour killings in certain religions. Just like with every other aspect of the Order of Nine Angles though, it's difficult to differentiate fact from fiction. But enough material exists related to culling to accept that, yes, it's likely still a part of the ONA's tradition, but they likely realise that it produces bad optics to discuss it so openly. Speaking of bad optics, let's take a look at one of the most shocking aspects of the ONA, and one of the reasons why they're considered to be a bunch of black magic Nazis. The first thing you'll see about the Order of Nine Angles if you decide to look into them yourself is articles related to Nazis, fascism and the actual far right, as in those who are literal neo-Nazis, as opposed to just somebody you disagree with on Twitter. As we've seen, there's certainly no shortage of Nazi symbolism and alignment with extremist ideologies within the ONA, and they hold Hitler up as some sort of inverted messiah figure. They also practice literal black magic, so certainly there's some truth in calling them black magic Nazis, but as with all things here, it goes far deeper and gets far more sinister. I've kept this section until nearer the end, as having a rough idea of what the ONA are and what they do will help to understand why they've adopted this sort of shocking symbolism. One thing to know about the ONA is that they are supremely elitist, more so than any other group I've ever encountered, and extremely arrogant, believing themselves through following the Sevenfold path to be a different type of human being who will be responsible for initiating aeonic shifts far into the causal future. They see themselves as heirs to a sinister aristocracy, believing themselves to be above all other beings and their laws, hence the drive to transgress through acts such as terrorism, murder and heresy. From around the late 1980s onwards, the Order of Nine Angles randomly published their own magazine called Fenrir, a word meaning he who dwells in the marches, which used a lot of Nazi symbolism and included tracts on things like race war, much of it mirroring David Myatt's activities in the non-ONA. As with the rest of the ONA's publications, the content typically shifted depending on what Myatt was involved with, which some have said may actually suggest that the ONA is literally the work of one man. For the ONA though, Nazism and Holocaust denial represent what they consider to be the modern heresy, the ultimate in anti-consensus beliefs to hold in the Western world. They are tools with which to shock the public, to break the candidate out of their old worldview, and to propagate one of the underlying myths of the ONA, that of the Magian ethos. The concept of the Magian can really be summed up quite easily: anti-Semitism. It's far more complicated than this, really, but it boils down to what the ONA see as the negative influence of Jews on the world. Clearly, this is a repackaged version of what Hitler was into, so again, we can see that there's evidence to support calling them Nazis, but that would be far too simple, because they consider themselves far superior to boring old Nazis. What we also have to bear in mind is that Myatt had extensive involvement with and wrote extensively on the Islamic State and supported acts of terrorism against the West. While the Nazi influence is clear, it's nowhere near as clear-cut, since the entire ONA system is equally influenced by Islam and other theocratic, fascistic movements. Furthermore, the existence of insight roles related to joining far-left, anarchist groups, radical feminist movements, and even becoming a Christian monk all suggest that the Nazi claim is far too one-dimensional and doesn't take into account how the ONA may well be infiltrating non-Nazi groups too. This, in my opinion, is one of the big mistakes that people are making when they make noise about how the ONA are just black magic Nazis. It's entirely possible that genuine ONA associates are present in the mainstream media, politics and business, but it's highly unlikely that you would ever know. Too many people who claim to be ONA talk the talk, but upon inspection rarely, if ever, walk the walk. Those who actually are identified with the ONA tend to remain silent and speak little of their work, much like those from any other mystical tradition. And when they do, their words tend to resonate with those who've experienced the ordeals. As I mentioned at the beginning, the Order of Nine Angles isn't really an order at all, in the sense that there's no hierarchy per se, and no regular group meetings like you'd find in other, even satanic groups. Instead, they are a sinister, esoteric association made up of what are known as collectives, comprising the following subgroups. Niners are essentially a freelance operative who resonates with the ONA worldview. Occasionally they'll be known as Drek, but Drek is more accurately part of one of the ONA gangs, which are also known as tribes. Typically, these are street gangs who use the Sevenfold way to conduct their business, and often exercise brutal tactics in the name of their beliefs, such as using holy oils to consecrate their guns before shooting gangland enemies dead. The traditional Nexians are typically your more classically structured groups, not always publicly identifying with the ONA, but usually based on their rituals and activities around the Black Book of Satan and Naos. Sinister empaths are something quite unique to the ONA and probably quite surprising. They're actually a very deeply feminist group, and one of the many reasons that they value the feminine so much and loathe the patriarchal tyranny they see in the world is the unique ability of women to experience a specific kind of empathy, intuition, and the ability to give birth. There exists an entire tradition within the ONA, or more correctly, the entire tradition which essentially birthed the ONA, known as the Remwitha, primarily women who use their abilities to understand the world, teach others, and guide the energies of the universe in ways more conducive to the aims of the ONA. The reason I haven't gone more into depth about the Remwitha is that, well, it's very difficult to describe, and due to the methods they employ, I, as a man, can't even really begin to understand it experientially. We also have individual sorcerers, and these are men and women who actively practice the rites and rituals of the Sevenfold way. Their path is a practical one, rather than the more mystical, introspective path of the Remwitha. Not a lot can really be said about the lone practitioner. They typically work in secret and don't disclose their affiliations readily, but their presence can be seen by those with eyes to see it. We also have the Balobians, which is the musicians, the artists, and the creatives whose work embodies the Sevenfold way. One of the few figures who've been publicly confirmed to be part of the ONA is a man by the name of Christos Beast, also known as artist Richard Mould, who produced one of the unique ONA tarot packs. The ONA pack follows largely the same structure as the major and minor arcana of something like the Rider-Waite set, but the symbolism and archetypal imagery used are wholly ONA inspired and incredibly unsettling. Most Balobians do not publicly claim association with the ONA either, but typically personify the satanic lifestyle. So as you can see, the Order of Nine Angles isn't quite as straightforward as it first appears, and the lack of data on membership, as well as the secrecy involved in being a Niner, make it very difficult to establish just how many are actively engaged in this work. The general figures bandied around make the ONA seem like a tiny cult, but I suspect that the reality is far more disturbing, especially when we consider just how far their aims and goals go. I'm only going to touch lightly on this because it's genuinely, absolutely fucking mental, and if I explain it badly, then it's just going to sound like Scientology or something. The ONA ultimately have in mind the domination of the entire galaxy. I know that sounds absurd, but that's genuinely something they believe and consider their actions in this period to be aimed towards bringing about what they refer to as the Imperium. Their entire reality tunnel involves a coexisting atemporal field known as the acausal, where beings exist who basically want to fuck your shit up and who they want to bring into being for the lulz. So really, the idea of galactic domination probably isn't all that wild. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to mock this because, in the context of the ONA's model, it actually makes sense in its own weird way, but I personally find it difficult to really understand, so I'll leave it to those interested to do their own reading. In the end, calling the ONA black magic Nazis, while funny, is a massive oversimplification and underestimates the potential danger in focusing on the Nazi stuff while ignoring the anarchist or Islamo-fascist elements of it too. Obviously they actually do black magic and believe similar things to the Nazis, but I hope that it's clear that there's more to their worldview than goose-stepping in robes, however hilarious that image may be. I've tried to stick to the facts and present what I consider to be the more interesting elements of the Order of Nine Angles in this video, so there's a lot that I haven't covered or that I could have gone more in depth with, but I hope that this has been at least vaguely informative. The Order of Nine Angles is a vast, complex and difficult subject to explore, especially without any knowledge of the way in which mystical paths and systems typically work. As I've said, there's a lot I haven't covered, and a lot I could have gone into a lot more detail on, but it would have involved explaining all sorts of other stuff and would have ended up with a video longer than a typo negative song. What we've seen should hopefully be enough to confirm that there's far more to the ONA than it would seem, and that, perhaps, beneath that blackened exterior, their central idea of pathaimathos, the path of suffering, holds some value. Properly understood, the Order of Nine Angles appears to be a genuinely satanic order who utilise extremism, heresy and offensiveness to stand against the status quo. I'm not condoning their beliefs or supporting them in any way, but their worldview just seems far too much like a tool in itself of internal alchemy where the individual is forced to face the horrors inside themselves, see that they too are capable of being complicit in things like the Holocaust, and that they manifest darkness where they imagine it to be light. In externalising their darkness, they purify themselves and integrate their shadow, this bringing them more in line with the sort of things that David Maya appears to be teaching nowadays. Again, I'm not defending them or claiming they're innocent of claims made against them, but I am saying that there's far more to this than satanic Nazis running amok and influencing kids online. I'll leave it to yourselves to judge and have your opinion. I just want to make the information available and attempt to offer some objectivity on a subject that can be difficult not to become emotional over. Satanism is still frowned upon, or at least viewed with incredulity and laughed at. And the presence of those who worship the inverse of a monotheistic god will always be in opposition to the Abrahamic traditions that our societies are built upon. Many people online nowadays espouse ideas which, to me, seem oddly reminiscent of those of the ONA, especially with regards to things like patriarchy, anti-Christianity, anti-Semitism, and hatred of the West and its structures. This is why I consider the ONA to be potentially more dangerous than they're given credit for. Sure, there's always the possibility that they're really just a minuscule group of die-hard oddballs, but that whole system just seems way too well planned. It's too coherent, too consistent with legitimate mystical paths to simply just brush it away like we can with Scientology and the like. Whether they do really prove to be any sort of danger remains to be seen, and they'll likely just continue as an underground phenomena, perhaps gradually losing the extremities and coagulating as a more peaceful movement, who knows. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video on the Order of Nine Angles, and I look forward to reading your comments below. Have a suitably sinister Samhain, and please consider dropping me a donation on Patreon or via PayPal on the links below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep it weird.